There is a strip of water 34 kilometers wide. 34. And right now, it is deciding the price of your groceries, the cost of heating your home, and whether the world wakes up tomorrow in peace or in the opening hours of something far darker. Pay attention, because what happens in those 34 kilometers in the next few days will matter to every living human being on this planet. Let us begin with a proposition that history teaches with extraordinary consistency. The great catastrophes of the modern age rarely announce themselves with a fanfare. They arrive quietly, dressed in the bureaucratic language of strategic necessity, and only in retrospect does the full weight of what has transpired become comprehensible to those who lived through it. What is unfolding today, on this 14th day of April in the year 2026, in the warm mineral blue waters of the Persian Gulf, is precisely such a moment. And unlike most such moments, we have the rare and sobering gift of witnessing it in real time. The Strait of Hormuz is not, in the conventional sense, a beautiful place. It is a choke point, a geological accident, a narrow bottleneck between the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian coast, barely 34 kilometers across at its most constricted passage, flanked on one side by the ancient civilization of Persia and on the other by the barren cliffs of Oman's Musandam Peninsula. It is not celebrated in poetry, it does not appear in tourist brochures, and yet for the better part of a century, it has been, without exaggeration, the single most consequential stretch of water on Earth. Before the guns of this war began firing on February 28th of this year, when American and Israeli aircraft conducted joint strikes against Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure, and in so doing, killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas pass through those 34 kilometers every single day. Every single day. 12 million barrels of crude oil, the lifeblood of the global industrial economy, flowing through a corridor no wider than the distance between Midtown Manhattan and Brooklyn. We speak often in the abstract about the interdependence of the modern world. We invoke it as though it were a platitude, a polite acknowledgement of globalization's triumph. But the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction. It is the arterial proof of that interdependence, rendered in steel-hulled tankers and compressed natural gas, in the winter heating bills of families in Warsaw and Lyon, in the fertilizer inputs that sustain the cornfields of Iowa, in the diesel that powers the trucks that move the goods that fill the shelves that feed the families that constitute the invisible architecture of modern life. When Iran shut that strait, and shut it, Iran did, with a comprehensiveness and ferocity that surprised even those who had long warned of this possibility. The world did not merely lose access to oil. It lost in an instant the assumption of normalcy upon which the entire global economy had been constructed. The closure was not gentle. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, did not merely issue warnings. They issued warnings and then they acted on them, with the methodical ruthlessness that has characterized that organization's operations for decades. 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels, sea mines laid throughout the waterway. On the 1st of March, the oil tanker Skylight was struck north of Kasab in Oman. 2 Indian crew members killed, 3 injured. The MT Via Oil was hit by a drone boat, its engine room set ablaze. 1 more Indian sailor dead, 21 more crew members forced to abandon ship into the warm waters of the Gulf. Ship tracking data told the story with clinical precision. A 70% collapse in traffic and then almost nothing. Over 150 vessels anchored outside the strait, their engines idling, their crews waiting, their owners calculating losses by the hour. The economic consequences were neither slow nor subtle. Brent crude oil, that indispensable benchmark of global energy markets, surged past $100 per barrel on March 8th for the first time in 4 years. At their peak, prices climbed to 120 SCFX per barrel, levels that analysts described, without hyperbole, as representing the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Worse, they said, than 1973. More destabilizing than any conflict in living memory. And today, as I speak to you on the 14th of April 2026, Brent crude is trading at approximately $102 per barrel, having jumped 8% on Monday alone when the naval blockade took effect. WTI, the American benchmark, sits near $97 per barrel. The 52-week range tells the full story, from $58.50 a barrel to a peak of $119.50. In a single year, the price of the world's most essential commodity nearly doubled, and at the American pump, the ALDA reports that the average price of gasoline has climbed to $4.125 per gallon, up sharply from $3.63 just 1 month ago. Iran's parliamentary speaker, with a contempt that was as revealing as it was provocative, posted a photograph of gas station prices near Washington, D.C., and wrote, Enjoy those numbers now, because soon you will be nostalgic for $4 or $5 gas. It was, in its way, a perfectly accurate observation about the economics of what his government had set in motion. But oil prices, as dramatic as they are, tell only part of the story, and perhaps not even the most consequential part. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a petroleum corridor. It is the conduit through which Europe receives much of the liquefied natural gas it requires to heat its homes and power its industry. It is the channel through which flow the potassium and phosphate compounds that farmers across the northern hemisphere apply to their fields in the spring planting season. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, not an institution given to theatrical pronouncements, issued a stark warning this week. Its chief economist stated plainly, a global food crisis could erupt if normal traffic does not resume. Fertilizer prices are projected to average 15 to 20% higher in the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues. Corn yields in the United States, the foundational feedstock for beef, poultry, and dairy, could fall measurably. The ripple effects, they warned, could push food prices higher well into 2027. By this week, 250 million barrels had been drained from global emergency reserves since the war began. The last two tankers carrying pre-war crude from Iraq and Kuwait, one heading to Malaysia, one to Australia, were still at sea. Once they deliver, the world will have exhausted every barrel of oil that left the strait before the first shots were fired. This is the context. This is the inheritance of 45 days of war. And it is against this backdrop of cratering supply, surging prices, draining reserves, and a global economy beginning to buckle under the weight of an energy shock without modern precedent, that the United States Navy, on the morning of Monday, April 13, 2026, at precisely 10 a.m. Eastern Time, began enforcing a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Not a patrol, not an escort mission, a blockade. The word itself carries the full juridical and military gravity of its historical meaning. An act of war, deliberately calibrated, legally complex, and operationally perilous. If you have found any value in understanding the world you actually live in, not the world of comfortable assumptions and yesterday's certainties, but the world as it is, raw and consequential and alive with danger, then I would ask you to subscribe to this channel, because the conversation we are having is one that almost no one in mainstream media is having with the seriousness it deserves. And it is going to matter to you. It is going to matter to your family. It is going to matter to your future. Subscribe now and stay with me, because we are only just beginning. It is necessary, at this point in our analysis, to resist the temptation toward narrative simplicity. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not arrive as a bolt from a clear sky. It arrived as the culmination of 6 weeks of escalating decisions, each one logical in its own narrow frame, each one pushing the next domino closer to the edge. Understanding where we are requires understanding how we got here, and that understanding, in turn, requires us to think clearly about the nature of strategic miscalculation, which is, historically speaking, the primary engine of catastrophe. When American and Israeli aircraft struck Iran on February 28th, the planners of that operation understood, presumably, that they were accepting a risk of Hormuz closure. What they appear to have underestimated, as planners of military operations invariably underestimate the adversary's resolve, because to fully credit that resolve would be to question the wisdom of the operation itself, is how quickly that closure would become total, how effectively the IRGC would enforce it, and how utterly unprepared the global economy was for an energy shock of this magnitude. The history of the 20th century is replete with examples of military planners who were brilliantly correct about the tactical dimension of their operations and catastrophically wrong about the strategic consequences. This crisis has a familiar shape. President Trump spent weeks attempting to resolve the closure through a mixture of threats and what might generously be called dynamic diplomacy. On March 3rd, he pledged that the Navy would begin escorting vessels through the strait as soon as possible. On March 22nd, he threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants. On March 27th, Iran announced a kind of toll booth regime, selectively permitting passage for vessels from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, while charging fees in excess of $1 million per ship, in some cases climbing to $2 million. Analysts from Lloyd's List Intelligence documented that at least 2 vessels paid these fees in Chinese yuan. Trump's response was characteristically unrestrained. He called it world extortion. And on this point, whatever one's broader assessment of his presidency, he was not wrong. A nation that closes an international waterway and then charges ransom for passage is engaging in precisely the kind of behavior that the post-World War II international order was designed to prevent. A ceasefire was brokered on April 8th following a Trump warning of an almost biblical register that Iran's whole civilization would die if no deal was reached. A fragile 2-week truce was agreed. For a brief and genuinely hopeful moment, the machinery of diplomacy appeared to be working. Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad, accompanied by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to meet directly with Iranian and Pakistani negotiators. The talks lasted more than 21 hours. They covered the Strait, Iran's nuclear program, the question of sanctions, the matter of war reparations, and the ongoing conflict in Lebanon, where Lebanese authorities report more than 2,000 deaths and over 6,500 wounded since early March. 21 hours of negotiation. 21 hours in which the fate of the global economy and perhaps of the broader peace hung in the careful, exhausting work of diplomacy. And then, at dawn on Sunday, April 12th, J.D. Vance walked out without a deal. The sticking point was Iran's nuclear program. Vance stated it plainly. The United States needed to see an affirmative commitment that Iran will not seek a nuclear weapon. Iran refused. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said his country had come in good faith, only to encounter what he characterized as maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. There is something almost tragically structural about this impasse. Iran's nuclear program is not simply a weapons program. It is, in the theology of the Islamic Republic, an assertion of sovereignty, of technological modernity, of the right of a proud and ancient civilization to determine its own destiny. And America's demand for its abandonment is not simply a non-proliferation position. It is, in the strategic logic of Washington and Tel Aviv, an existential requirement. These are not positions between which a clever negotiator can easily split the difference. They represent fundamentally incompatible conceptions of what the other side is entitled to be. Hours after Vance landed back in Washington, Trump announced the blockade. U.S. Central Command confirmed it would be enforced against all vessels entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, with one critical clarification. Ships traveling between non-Iranian ports would not be impeded. So the strait itself was not fully closed to all commerce. But any vessel going to or from Iran was now in the operational crosshairs of the United States Navy, the most capable maritime force in human history. Trump explained his logic with characteristic directness. We cannot let a country blackmail or extort the world. He also warned, via Truth Social, that any Iranian vessel approaching the blockade would be, in his words, immediately eliminated using the same system of kill used against drug traffickers at sea. It is quick and brutal, he added, as though the brevity of the warning were itself a form of diplomacy. Iran's response was fierce and immediate. The Defense Ministry called the blockade piracy. Iran's armed forces declared that the country's ports are either for everyone or for no one. General Zolfikari went further, threatening to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the critical waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, in direct retaliation. This is not an idle threat. The Bab el-Mandeb is the gateway through which a substantial portion of European and American maritime trade flows. Its closure would compound an already historic supply shock with consequences that are genuinely difficult to fully calculate. In the early hours of the blockade's enforcement, the first vessels began making their calculations. The Elpis, a sanctioned Iranian shadow fleet tanker registered in Comoros, defied the order and passed through. A Botswana-registered tanker called the Austria turned back just 41 minutes after the deadline, rerouting from Oman to the UAE. Another vessel, the Rich Starry, broadcast that it was drifting off the coast of Keshem Island, frozen, apparently, in the paralysis of indecision that economic coercion is specifically designed to produce. By the end of Monday, 31 vessels had passed through the strait in the previous 24 hours, but most were traveling in ballast, carrying nothing, empty ships, threading a needle between two navies. OPEC's own figures, released this week, showed that the cartel's collective output had declined 7.9 million barrels per day in March alone due to the closure of the strait. Saudi Arabia, for its part, announced it had restored full pumping capacity through its east-west pipeline. A workaround, but a partial one. The world needs the strait. The international reaction has been fractured, revealing, and in some respects, alarming. Britain will not join the blockade. Prime Minister Starmer stated this plainly, directing his government's energies instead toward what he called restoring freedom of navigation through diplomatic and mind-sweeping means. France's Macron announced a conference of more than 40 nations to pursue what he described as a strictly defensive multinational mission, completely separate from the American effort. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi warned that blockading the strait does not serve the common interests of the international community. Israel backed the blockade fully, with Netanyahu denying any rift with Washington. Spain's defense minister called it senseless. Pope Leo XIII, a new pontiff, who has become increasingly vocal on this war, and who has now drawn a direct and public attack from President Trump, who called him weak on crime and terrible on foreign policy, criticized what he described as violations of international law by neocolonial powers. What we are witnessing, in other words, is not merely a military confrontation. It is a profound fracturing of the Western alliance over a question that is simultaneously strategic, legal, moral, and economic, and it is happening in real time, in a waterway that the world cannot afford to lose. Let us now attempt the most difficult task in any analysis of an ongoing crisis, not merely to describe what has happened, but to think clearly about what it means, what might come next, and, most importantly, what it reveals about the deeper architecture of the world we actually inhabit. We have, in the course of the past 45 days, witnessed the largest disruption to global oil supply in the history of the petroleum era. We have watched a ceasefire negotiated and then effectively collapse. We have seen the United States impose a naval blockade, an act with specific and weighty legal implications under international law against the ports of a sovereign nation. We have watched America's closest European allies decline to participate, choosing instead to organize an alternative diplomatic coalition. We have watched oil prices climb from roughly $65 per barrel before the war to a peak of $119.50 before settling at around $102 as of this morning, with WTI hovering near 97. We have watched American consumers absorb a jump of nearly 50 cents per gallon at the pump in a single month. And we have watched a delegation led by the Vice President of the United States spend 21 hours in Islamabad, Pakistan, attempting to negotiate a peace that, when it came to the fundamental question of nuclear weapons, proved impossible to achieve. The question of the blockade's legality is not merely academic. Military analysts at King's College London have warned that enforcing it will be legally contested, operationally high risk, and diplomatically explosive. A retired U.S. Navy admiral told CNN's Fareed Zakaria that enforcing even a limited version of the blockade would require 2 full aircraft carrier strike groups and over a dozen surface ships outside the strait, plus at least 6 destroyers inside the Gulf, with additional support from the navies of Gulf partners like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. This is not a small commitment. This is, in the language of military logistics, a sustained major combat operation, being conducted simultaneously with whatever ongoing air campaign may or may not be in prospect against Iran itself. Trump has not ruled out resuming strikes. The Wall Street Journal reported this week that the administration is actively considering limited military action against Iran to break the negotiating stalemate. These are not abstractions. These are decisions being made right now by human beings in offices in Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, Beijing, and Moscow, each with their own calculations, their own fears, their own red lines, and their own catastrophic potential for miscalculation. Consider the structural trap that both sides now face. Iran cannot reopen the strait without surrendering its primary source of leverage, and in doing so, concede that the strategy of closure failed. A revolutionary government that has organized its identity around resistance to American power cannot be seen to yield to American coercion without paying an extraordinary domestic political price. And yet Iran's economy, already strained by decades of sanctions, is now under a compound pressure that is, by any measure, severe. Oil revenues have collapsed. The rial has cratered. Ordinary Iranians are paying prices that have risen roughly 40% in the past year, according to reporting this week. The Islamic Republic is not a state that has historically retreated from confrontation because of domestic economic pressure, but there is a threshold beyond which even the most ideologically committed government must reckon with the material conditions of its own people. The United States, for its part, faces its own set of constraints that are less often acknowledged. A prolonged blockade that fails to reopen the strait, which means a blockade that Iran simply absorbs and works around, using shadow fleets and alternative routes and Chinese yuan transactions as it has already begun to do, is not a success. It is an expensive, diplomatically costly, legally contested, operationally demanding exercise that achieved nothing except the further deterioration of already fragile relations with European allies, the further consolidation of Iran's sense of grievance, and the continued punishment of the American consumer at the gasoline pump. The Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, said on Monday that he expects oil prices to peak sometime in the next few weeks as meaningful ship traffic eventually gets through. He may be right, but the confidence implicit in that projection, that the blockade will work, that Iran will fold, that traffic will resume, rests on a series of assumptions that history gives us rather little reason to simply accept. There is, of course, the possibility of a deal. As of today, Tuesday, April 14th, U.S. officials confirm that communication between the two sides continues. Trump himself said that Iran wants to make a deal very badly. Vance left open the door to further talks. The logic of economic pain on both sides creates at least the theoretical conditions for compromise. But the nuclear question, the fundamental existential question of whether the Islamic Republic has or does not have the right to enrich uranium, has not become more tractable merely because 21 hours of talks failed to resolve it. It remains what it has always been, the hardest problem in Middle Eastern geopolitics, the one that has resisted resolution through every instrument of diplomacy, sanctions, coercion, and threat that the international community has brought to bear over 3 decades. And meanwhile, the mines are still in the water. The guns are still loaded on both sides. Lebanon is still in flames. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said there can be no stability in the Middle East while Lebanon burns, and called the closure of the strait greatly damaging to the entire world. A Lebanese Red Cross ambulance team was struck by an Israeli drone on April 13th. One paramedic was killed. The human cost of this conflict, which extends far beyond the immediate theater of the US-Iran confrontation, continues to accumulate. What, then, does a serious person conclude from all of this? I would suggest several things, stated as plainly as the evidence supports. First, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was always among the most consequential strategic risks in the global economy, and the world was, and remains, woefully underprepared for it. 45 days into this crisis, with 250 million barrels drawn from emergency reserves and fertilizer inputs for the spring planting season in jeopardy, the adequacy of global energy security architecture is exposed as deeply insufficient. Whatever the outcome of this particular confrontation, the world requires a serious reckoning with that vulnerability. Second, the fracturing of Western unity over the blockade is not a minor diplomatic inconvenience. It is a structural development with long-term implications for the coherence of the American-led international order. When Britain and France organize an alternative coalition explicitly separate from American action, and when Spain calls that American action senseless, and when more than 40 nations coalesce around a mission defined in opposition to the American approach, something is being revealed about the limits of unilateral American power that will not be easily or quickly repaired. Third, the nuclear question is not going away. Iran's refusal to make an affirmative commitment on nuclear weapons was the proximate cause of the Islamabad talks' failure. It will be the proximate cause of any future talks' failure unless one side, either the United States or Iran, makes a fundamental reassessment of its position. History gives us limited confidence that such reassessments occur easily or quickly. And fourth, and perhaps most important of all, what happens in 34 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman is not a regional story. It is not a Middle Eastern story. It is a story about every family that pays an electricity bill, every farmer who buys fertilizer, every parent who fills a gas tank to drive a child to school, every pensioner who heats a home. The interconnectedness of the modern economy, which in prosperous times feels like a source of abundance, reveals itself in moments like this as a network of vulnerabilities, each one attached to the next, each one capable of transmitting shock across the system with the speed and thoroughness that our political institutions, designed for a slower world, are struggling to process. The blockade is in effect. The mines are still in the water. 31 ships passed through in the past 24 hours, most of them carrying nothing. Oil is at $102 a barrel, and climbing. Gas at the American pump is $4.125 per gallon and rising. The world is waiting. History is not waiting. I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you believe happens next. Does Iran blink? Does the blockade hold? Does a deal get done? Or does this escalate into something far more dangerous? The most interesting geopolitical conversation in the world is happening right now, and it belongs in the comments section of this video. What is your honest assessment of where this ends?